Yeah.
But Bunberg was getting up to introduce a bill.
Did you have a bill?
I don't think it would come.
Yeah. Yep. So we've got a few people online. So Victoria, would you have a few things you might want to say?
Good afternoon, committee. My name is Victoria Potts with Kansas Legislative Research. And I just wanted to take a second to introduce myself and to also point out the binder that is at each of your spots. That binder contains the performance-based budgeting templates for every state agency, so not just the ones that are appearing in this committee, but every state agency. This template was created at the request of House Appropriations to allow agencies and committee members another way to view the budget. So just wanted to provide that. It's also online at Kansas Legislative Research's website if you prefer to look at it online. And that was it, unless there's any questions about the binder, or I'm happy to answer questions about the committee or future information requests.
Any questions for Victoria? Thank you, Victoria. It looks like the first one up is the Honorable Mike Bean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Mike Bean, Kansas Department of Ag. I have the pleasure of serving as the secretary, and we have put together prepared, I think, 3-page prepared statement. I'm not going to read all of it, I'm going to capture some of that.
Mr. Chairman, Mike's microphone is not on, apparently. I can't hear him. I was able to hear Victoria.
Blue light is on.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So again, I'm Mike Beam, representing the Department of Ag, and have the pleasure of serving as secretary. So what we thought we'd do, I think based on our understanding of the assignment, is just kind of hit some high points of our budget, because we'll come back for the actual budget hearing, and then Kellen will talk a little about our performance-based budgeting process. But the Department of Ag is pretty diverse, addresses a lot of different programs. We have 15 separate programs and 6 divisions within the agency. So this obviously relates to farmers and ranchers, but also agribusinesses, quite a bit with consumers. And we address everything from grain warehouse inspection, animal disease traceability, plant protection, animal facilities inspection. But overall, there's about 330 individuals that work for the Kansas Department of Ag. Almost half of those are away from our headquarters in Manhattan. So we have several Division of Water Resources offices across the state, and a lot of our people work out of their home all across the state in our home-based efforts. So the budget highlights, you'll see at the bottom of the first page, there's 2 charts, the bottom of the first page and the top of the second page. But this essentially gives you an overview of the first one on our funding. We basically have a $55.1 million budget for fiscal year 22 that was adjusted. And then the FY23 as proposed by the governor would be $54.3 million. The important, I think, for a lot of people to understand is the breakout of our revenue. So for FY22, it's about $9 million in state general fund. It is proposed to increase to $1.1 million. So you'll see the balance of our revenues with state water plan funds, which predominantly, if not exclusively, all go back out to conservation districts and then to land, applied to land and landowners. We do get some EDIF funds, also fee funds are a big part of our budget. federal funds. So you see our total for FY22 adjusted is $55,131,000, and our fiscal year 23 budget is $54,283. What may not be obvious is that with an increase of over $1 million in state general funds proposed for FY23, the reason it's still less than FY22 adjusted is that there's a lot of state water plan funds from the previous years that will show up in our FY22. Many of those are obligated, but the work is not done and the money hasn't been distributed. So that's why you'll see a bigger FY22 adjusted than FY23. And then the next page at the top of the page shows you how we disperse those funds or where our costs are. And obviously 47% of our agency is salary and wages. Then you'll see the breakdown with other funding sources. A lot of aid to local units or local partners. So one unusual situation in FY22 is we had about $2.8 million of federal coronavirus relief funds that we handled through grants to meat processors, food entities, Secure and Local Food Grant. It was actually about a $12.8 million project that we administered, but $10 million of that was through the Department of Commerce. We handled about $2.8 million. And then you'll see the rest of the categories. One other change, there's a pretty big increase in rent, and that's simply because the new lab that's in Manhattan, right next to our office, was built and finished in the spring of 2020. Part of the agreement with the landowner, the landlord, which is K-State Foundation, is we'd get the first year rent free. So we didn't have rent on that lab for that first year. Now it's incorporated in our total rent expenses. I'd say you'll see some bullets at the bottom of page 2. Some of the noticeable changes or notable changes that you'll see with the governor's budget is there's another almost $330 million from state general funds going to the meat and poultry inspection program. Ever since the pandemic and the supply chain crunch and people looking to buy locally, we've seen a big ramp up in interest in local meat processing. So already since the pandemic, we've had 17 new processors, and we're working with 20 more. So we're really seeing a very big increase in the demand for our services for the state inspected plants. The good news is for every dollar that the state puts in, except for capital outlays, for every dollar the state puts in, we get matched with federal dollars through our agreement with USDA. Also is about $384,000 for a part of our Division of Water Resources, which is water structures. We have several positions open, and we haven't filled those because we just haven't had the revenue. We've had a steady decline in fee revenues in that program because of legislation that passed several years ago. And so the governor was supportive enough to put $383,000 into that to help us fund the position that we already have and also the cost for vehicle and travel. There's also $484,000 for the animal facility inspection program. This will allow us to ramp that program up so it can meet its statutory obligation. Would allow us to hire 3 people and also have the fund available to support shelters if they're needed for our program in enforcing those situations. And then on the last page is kind of a summary of what we were talking about prior to this. We started is our allotment of state water plan monies through the state governor's budget. So there you'll see a little over $100,000 for soil health, aid to conservation districts. We just passed that through all the conservation districts, so they're would receive a big increase. And then the Water Resources Cost Share Program, $450,000. And that's a program that has quite a bit of flexibility when we get to address, work with conservation districts and landowners to address water quality primarily, and in some cases water quantity. So in recent years, and you'll see all the various sources, which include terraces and sediment control, some alternative livestock watering, but we've also used that monies in that program for irrigation technology practices, working with landowners and irrigators who want to try to adopt some of the new technology that makes it much more efficient to utilize the declining aquifer. So that again is pretty quick overview of the budget, what we've done to date, and the governor's enhancements. And I'd be happy to respond to any more questions that you might have before Kellen comes forward.
Committee, any questions?
Of course.
Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, just a question under meat and poultry inspection. That's a one-to-one match, but do you know at this point what your projected hiring of inspectors and compliance staff, I'm not sure this shows how many people you're considering, but with 17 already and 20 new processors, just wondering what your projection is.
So we were looking at, when we submitted that, 6 positions, new positions, and the vehicles and travel expense for those. And I might add, probably part of the challenge is, number one, private industry is seeing this, and that's retaining employees. So we're having a lot of turnover. Whenever you have sickness or turnover, the existing employees have to try to cover that additional area, and if we get too thin, then it dictates the days that those plants can operate. So we're trying to ramp up to give us more flexibility and to meet the increase in demand for our services.
Just one follow-up, Mr. Chairman. I think that's great, Mr. Secretary. That's been needed, and now especially. But one other area that we've discussed in previous budgets, and I think there was an LPA audit on the inspectors that go out and check retail stores for prices, what they have in their POS system versus what they're charging, or vice versa. Are you doing anything there?
We are.
Okay.
We made a decision not to request any additional staffing yet, but we've made a lot of adjustments and are working, instead of just seeing how many inspections we can do and having, because it's hard to reach compliance. You have to have over 92%, and you'll find just unintentional errors. So we're redirecting and putting priorities on those that we think are the biggest risk. And then we're working, offering some education services to those instead of just, going through and submitting summary orders or civil penalties. And they can go that route, or they can work with us and trying to learn about that process. And so we think we're much more efficient with the resources we have. Later this summer or fall, we'll analyze whether we think we need to come to the legislature for additional resources. But now we're going to try to make do with what we have and do a better job of it.
Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Great presentation as usual. Looking here at the processing plants, that's kind of my world for a long time. How's that going to look 5-10 years from now, do you think?
Well, it's a difficult business, and
very hard.
It's my hope that we'll be able to retain all of those businesses and maybe continue to grow. Nationally, there's a big push for what was considered mid-sized. USDA's come out with, I think, a $500 million grant program for those small to mid-size plants, which would be probably larger than all these plants that we serve. So there's a big push to increase capacity. And it's a challenge for those small plants. They have challenges with labor. They have challenges what to do with the offal or the byproducts. That's a challenge. But, you know, they're still booked out many of them over a year. So it's going to be largely determined by local consumers how much they're wanting to do business with their local plants. But hopefully it'll continue to grow a little bit and sustain itself.
So selfishly, love those places. I worked in those places, and I'm telling you, this is a way better job than that. This is really easy compared to working in that locker plant. I just tell you, that's not a job, that's not a destiny. But with marketing, I think we can make that model more sustainable going forward. I think there's a demand for the products that we produce here. They're unique, they're great quality, and I hope in the years to come, and I know maybe that's a commerce issue or whatever, but boy, marketing for that product's really going to be critical. Thank you.
And if I may, that's what's, I think, driving the increase in capacity, and more of them is our producers who are wanting to get a larger share of the dollar, and they believe they can market that product themselves, or a small group of producers. They've got to have that processing plant to do it. So you're right. If they're successful, they'll only grow, and that will increase demand for those services.
Representative Newland, online.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary. I guess my question goes back to some of these small operations. Some of these operations will not be inspected if they are just custom butchering. Is that the truth?
They still are subject to inspection, but not to the same degree. The plant itself is inspected, but the animals aren't inspected like prior to harvest and so forth. But they still have to have some inspection.
Okay, that's the difference I was looking.
Yep.
Any other questions? I've got a couple of questions, Mr. Secretary. On your processing facilities, do you kind of have maybe like a map, or so we can kind of see where those are strung out through Kansas?
We can put that together.
That'd be kind of nice, so if people have something, they might be able to.
Yes, and seems like there's a demand for that about November, because those are a lot of the plants that handle the deer, and we've had issues with making sure that people are aware of who is taking deer and who would be available, and we can get that for you.
And the next paragraph, where we're talking about water structures and dams, are you basically talking private dams, your watersheds? Are you, if there's a problem, are you putting the emphasis on you all are going to pay for the fixing, or is that going to be upon the landowner?
No, any dam that reaches a certain size is subject to inspection. Certain size and risk factor, what's downstream of it. So it can be municipalities, watershed districts, privately owned. And what we're trying to do is keep up with doing the inspections of those and providing that service, because they need to be periodically inspected. Chief Engineer Earl Lewis made a presentation to the interim committee this fall, and what we're trying to do is get an analysis of how much structural repairs need to happen to all these dams. It's hundreds of millions of dollars, and we're not able to come forth with additional resources to do a lot of those. There'll be some in the water plan money, but this is just to fund our 3 staff that can go out and keep up with inspecting those.
And the reason I'm going there with this, a lot of these dams and watershed dams, when they were built, the specs were okay. And nothing's really changed, but I know on some watersheds and private dams that they're being required to raise the level of the pool, and I'm just wondering where all that money's coming from.
That's a challenge. We've found that we've had situations where a private dam was obviously going bad and about to breach, and we tried to encourage them to go ahead and breach it, and they didn't have the resources to do it. So it's a tough situation, and a lot of these structures are 50 years old. So they're going to be, our repair bills are pretty big. Ours, the private sectors as well.
My last question, how many conservation districts are there?
I believe there's 104 or 105, but most, I think every county has one. Yes, sir, at the county level.
So, that's all I've got. Any other questions? Good job, Mr. Secretary.
We'll be available for any further questions. Thank you. May I have Kellen come up now?
Yep.
All right.
Well, good afternoon, Chairman Corbett and members of the committee. As Secretary Beam stated, I am Kellen Leach, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Chief Fiscal Officer for the Kansas Department of Agriculture. The first thing that I believe you should have in your packet is about a 6 or 7 page document. It's the Kda Budget Overview. I'm not going to delve into it too deeply today, but as the Secretary did point out a couple different things about our budget, I would bring this to your attention as well, that it's a good thing to review before our full budget hearing, because not only does it have our expenditures and our agency funding, but it also breaks out all of our divisions and programs and their funding sources, and it will show state general fund, fee fund revenue, other appropriated funds, and things of that nature. So I at least wanted to make a comment about that and kind of a footnote per se, that you might take a look at that before our full budget presentation, and I'm sure in a couple of weeks. But the main reason why I stand before you today is for performance-based budgeting. KDA was one of the first agencies that incorporated pieces of performance-based budgeting into our budget back as early as 2016. So as part of these Kansas Statute 75-3718B, I like to be very specific. We're always happy to continue to provide that transparent information back to the legislature, stakeholders, and other interested parties. As Victoria also stated, it was part of a House Committee on Appropriations request last year, and during the interim, we've also stood before that committee and given a presentation on our performance-based budget, so we've had the opportunity to give it a couple of times. I will state that when we do our performance-based budget, not only do we provide metrics or indices of our agency, we also break each of our programs or divisions down into sub-programs called decision packages, which you'll be able to see when we stand before you for the full budget presentation. But we also have each of our programs and divisions budget by those subsectors as well. So we're able to pull specific pieces out from each part of our programs and divisions, which we think is kind of a feather in our cap, as you might say, that we're not just able to provide metrics or indicators, but we're able to bring those back full circle with how we were actually budgeted. So bringing that full circle, as I said, we do have 15 separate programs within KDA as those 6 separate divisions. And it's my understanding that you got a really nice big binder today that has all of the performance-based budgeting templates for all of the agencies, but you also should have received a handout that is just the pages for the Department of Ag. So I will give a little bit of the background of what we did on ours when we were tasked with that question last fall before we submitted our budget. And then obviously I'm happy to stand for any questions as part of the performance-based budget process or our budget as a whole. So we split ours into the 15 separate programs. KLRD was nice enough to provide us a template to utilize across all agencies. In the first bite of the apple that we took was to separate all of our programs out into individual templates. So you will see one for each of these 15 separate programs. So for example, the first one you will see is administrative services. That statute I referenced earlier does outline pretty specifically what you're supposed to give as part of a performance-based budget. It states that you're supposed to give your statutory basis, whether there's a maintenance of effort requirement, whether there's a match requirement at the federal level. So that's a lot of the pieces that are codified in this template. I will point out that in KDA, the only program that we noted as mandatory, or excuse me, as discretionary, was administration, because all of the other programs have very strong state statute that is underlying the practice of those programs, and they are regulatory programs or programs in which that statute authorizes their function and their purpose. Now, it might be a little hard for KDA to fulfill some of their duties without an administrative services division, but we did mark them as discretionary because the only statute authorizing the administrative services is the overarching creation of the powers of the Secretary of Agriculture, or the agency in and of itself. We do have a couple of programs within KDA that have a maintenance of effort or a match requirement. Secretary Beam talked about meat and poultry, those small slaughterhouses, those small facilities. Because we receive that one-to-one funding from the federal government, we do have a maintenance of effort requirement that we have to match the funding that they're putting in. We also have a couple of programs that have a match requirement, and those would be on federal funds, and you'll see that as you go through. I'm not going to bore you through all 15 pages of information, but I will give a little bit of the thought process. Our output measures for each of the programs, they're tangible items that can be tracked. They're a completed item, an action, a document. So for example, for administrative services, it's the number of open records requests processed, the number of vouchers processed in SMART for fiscal. Then if you look above the outcome, that's our measure in effectiveness or efficiency. So that's going to be a percent, or it's going to show the outcome that we received from those outputs. And we tried to have a high correlation there, also relating back to the goals. And so we would have 15 pages of those. As you go through, there's a couple that decreased slightly in fiscal year 20 and 21. By far, over 90% of the time, it was due to COVID, because we weren't physically in a plant or a place of business doing inspections, at least in the beginning. But for example, like Secretary Beam stated for meat and poultry, you can turn to the meat and poultry inspection one, and you can see the increase in the number of licensees there. Between 2019 and 2021, it's gone from 397 to 526. So that does give us those indicators and those metrics there to support that increase in funds request. So most of the other ones there are very much in line there. I don't think I have too many other things to point out, but I would be happy if you wanted to peruse through those pages of the performance measures there. We'd be happy to answer any specific questions. Obviously happy to answer any questions about the budget overview. We'll return to answer any of those questions, and then happy to provide the additional budget information and clarity at our budget hearing as well.
Committee, any questions? Representative Gardner?
Just comment, Mr. Chairman. I've always, I think it was last year or the year before, I just gave a bunch of kudos to the Ag Department because they were way ahead in performance-based budgeting and the metrics and how to measure success or failure. You didn't surprise me at all with what you have presented to us today. They look, I still believe you ought to have a workshop with everyone else, but thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
I've got a couple of questions for you. On the comments you made, it's on it'd be like the second page on this sheet here at the bottom, where you've got the Animal Facilities Inspection Program. Who was doing that prior to, who was doing this job prior to this? If this will be an addition?
Well, the Animal Facilities Inspection Program has been a part of our Division of Animal Health. So we're not necessarily replacing that. We're making it a more robust program within the Division of Animal Health. So we were asking for the funding to support that and to fund some positions that we haven't had the funding for in the past. So it hasn't been, we've had the auspice of that in the past under the Division of Animal Health.
And my reason for asking that, I remember sitting and approached kind of the last few hours of approached, and this was one of the governor's requests was for $500,000 for this to be in last year's budget. So it looked a little familiar, and I just think it was probably just now has been maybe a suggestion to have it included, I guess. So
it was part of one of the GBA number 3 from last legislative session. So it's not the first time that it's come up on.
And how many, maybe Mike will know this, but how many FTEs do you have that are not filled currently?
Within the entire agency? I don't know off the top of my head, neither does the secretary, but we'd be happy to provide that back to you.
Online, anybody have any questions? Great job. You do a good job. Thank you very much. Victoria, do you need to say anything before we do KDHE? So, go ahead. Okay, Thursday, that's right. They can't come today. So, guys and gals, if anything else for the good of the cause, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.